Good morning, everyone. We're China Team A, and this is our strategy towards China. My name is Carrie Lee, and along with Katie Meyer, Alden Rolfe, Mingxi Chao, we'll go over our grand strategy. Currently, U.S. foreign policy is directed by the view that China is a competitor that poses a threat to American and global security, and that it must be contained. This can be seen in the policies primarily started by former President Trump, most prominently the imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods, and the continuation and expansion of these positions by President Biden. The current U.S. position is misguided and fundamentally misunderstands China. Further going down this path of aggressive containment will only result in the self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict with China, which will be epitomized by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Thus, the United States should instead work to de-escalate tensions with China and establish grounds for peaceful coexistence that facilitates the ability for cooperation in addressing shared issues. To do so, the United States should maintain its position of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan, prevent an escalation of tensions over the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific, and normalize trade relations with China. All of this is to avoid the worst-case scenario of going into conflict, both hot and cold, with China and undermining global security, which will only occur under U.S. provocation. To be clear, we're still recognizing China's ability to threaten U.S. interests in the region, and we still wish to contain China through reaffirming current U.S. alliances and maintaining military spending in the region. However, Chinese actions in the region are ultimately not analogous to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To reiterate, an invasion of Taiwan would only occur if current intentions in Washington to increase U.S. military presence in Taiwan and East Asia through policies such as forming an Asian equivalent of NATO are heightened. When discussing China's growing international presence, two regions are of particular importance: Taiwan and the South China Sea. We see Taiwan as an important aspect of ensuring that China cannot take more encroaching actions in the Indo-Pacific and vital in supplying the world with semiconductors. Thus, Taiwan should have the ability to deter and defend against an attack by China. But we do not believe in supporting the island without any limitations. In terms of the South China Sea, we believe in maintaining the stability of the region by reducing initiatives that could provoke China in the region. To understand our approach to China, it is important to outline what our view of China is. Despite its strengths in its growing military, leading role in important markets such as EVs and solar panels, and greater international influence, we view China as a declining power with many complex issues that will prevent it from challenging the U.S. hegemonic role in the world order. Four main areas mark its decline. Firstly, China is slowing in its economic growth, not only in terms of size, but also in its health of composition, indicating that its ability to overtake the U.S.'s leading role as the world's leading economy is waning. Its debt-to-GDP ratio has been rising steadily, climbing to over 300% in 2023. Secondly, China is suffering from lower fertility rates and an aging population, with experts predicting that the population will fall by 109 million by 2050. This would greatly burden the Chinese government as a country with a less dynamic workforce and likely will have to carry on more to its already massive debt to pay for pensions and social services. The Chinese government will immensely struggle with this, especially considering its slowing economy. Thirdly, due to recent events such as the zero-COVID policy and trends such as high rates of youth unemployment, the Chinese people are increasingly becoming dissatisfied with the regime. This can be seen in protests across China to end the zero-COVID policy, indicating that the CCP's legitimacy and survival are at stake. Finally, foreign policy initiatives such as the Belt and Road Project have failed to bring more countries under the Chinese sphere of influence and generate tangible economic benefits for China, sometimes even becoming financial liabilities such as cases of unfinished railway projects across Africa. Its more aggressive actions in East Asia have failed to coerce its targets effectively and only resulted in generating animosity from these states, isolating China to an even greater extent. For a government whose main concerns are its own survival and internal stability, these issues will constrain China from taking drastic actions internationally and effectively combat US influence. This is our agenda for today. We'll first go over a military overview of our policy suggestion. Then we'll talk about regional relations in the Indo-Pacific and the US's role in that. And finally, we'll end with an analysis of the Chinese economy and regime. I now pass the floor to our military expert, Katie.
I'm Katie, and I will be discussing our military strategy towards China. First of all, we maintain America's ongoing policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. We will continue to refrain from formal diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. We will also refrain from any symbolic gestures, such as Nancy Pelosi's 2022 visit. While we stand in opposition to any Chinese effort to forcibly take control of the island territory, we do not recognize Taiwan's autonomy and will not support its independence. We have determined that it is highly unlikely that China will attempt an invasion of Taiwan. An effective invasion would require a coordinated operation across the 90-mile-wide Taiwan Strait. Amphibious invasions are inherently complex and risky, and this geography poses particular challenges. Any attack would be limited to 2 brief periods in roughly April or October between the regular monsoon seasons. Even in optimal weather conditions, the Taiwan Strait is extremely turbulent. The shallow waters along most of the western coast and the cliffs along the eastern coast would further restrict and slow the final stretch of an invasion. It would also take hours for each ship to cross the strait. To transport the necessary hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers with the current or even greatly expanded military fleet would take weeks. With modern intelligence, it would already be highly unlikely for China to achieve strategic surprise in this operation. But even if it did, the slow pace of this strait crossing would give Taiwanese forces at least some amount of time to coordinate their defense before the Chinese military presents itself in full force. If, against all these odds, China successfully got its troops on Taiwanese shores, they would still struggle to capture the critical capital city of Taipei, which is encircled by mountains and has few routes for land travel, which Taiwan could defend or destroy. The urban concentration of the Taiwanese population in Taipei and other major cities would also require a slow and costly street-by-street invasion. All of this along with the fact that Taiwan would have the advantage of a defensive war over a terrain that it inherently knows much better than China. One can see the immense obstacles that China would struggle to surmount at every phase of a prospective invasion. And even if it were feasible, it would be a tremendous liability to the Chinese government. Internally, China would have to deal with untold monetary costs, resources, and troop deployment. Internationally, China would face the scrutiny and consequences that come with a violent territory invasion. We can look to Russia's Ukraine invasion as one example of how another country's power grab backfired. In addition to the estimated 500,000 Russian casualties and the estimated $211 billion in military spending, Russia has suffered widespread international condemnation. Some of its most powerful trade partners, including the EU, United States, and Great Britain, have imposed costly economic sanctions on Russia. This all for an invasion that has now depleted Russia's energy and resources for 2 years, with no end in sight. If Russia should someday succeed, it will be at an unimaginable cost. China would be much the same way. Our critics will cite Xi Jinping's proclaimed 2049 deadline for reunification with Taiwan. We recognize that in a perfect world for the Chinese government, China would regain control of Taiwan. However, as it is, this assertion is chiefly rhetoric. The CCP is trying to appeal to national sentiments within China and assert its power abroad. We cannot take these words at face value. We cannot let ideological rhetoric guide our practical actions towards China. The reality is that a Taiwan invasion would risk a vast amount of money, troops, and resources. We do not know China as a country that takes such great risks. Even an all but impossible invasion success would merely be a Pyrrhic victory for China. Still, we will do everything reasonably possible to further deter China from the already highly improbable case of invasion. We will equip Taiwan by bolstering its store of defensive technology. This spring, the Biden administration approved a 360 million weapons sales to Taiwan. We will continue to supply these defensive weapons as Taiwan requests. We will not provide, invest, or condone the use of offensive weapons. By supporting Taiwan's highly precautionary defensive capabilities, we will further deter China from taking violent action in a region where it already stands to lose. Our proposed defensive support will help ensure the protection of the people and culture of Taiwan. Any more aggressive approach would unnecessarily agitate China, leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy of war. We also recognize the importance of keeping the South China Sea secure. To expand on that, I turn the floor to our regional expert, Alden.
My name is Alden Rolfe, and I will be discussing our regional strategy for how to approach China and the Indo-Pacific. Regionally, there are three key points that are essential to maintain a safe and stable Indo-Pacific plan. Firstly, we look to recognize the pre-existing counterbalancing within the region and highlight its past successes. We will show how the balancing the U.S. has already built up is already sufficient at maintaining and containing China. Then we will halt the expansion of these alliances to stop provoking China and to stop the spiral leading to a hot war with China. Finally, we hope to leverage this newfound trust to establish new channels of communication and cooperation. We believe that the organizational building the U.S. has already done in the region is enough to contain China's regional ambitions, especially considering that China is currently struggling to deal with domestic issues that has to place a heavier emphasis on. So far, the U.S. has already built alliances, defensive pacts, and cooperative organizations such as AUKUS and the Quad to limit the amount of aggressive posturing China can take within the region. Organizations like AUKUS have worked to strengthen and facilitate new defenses to other regional nations. Non-nuclear nations like Australia have been given new cutting-edge nuclear technologies, primarily in the form of submarines. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, also known as the Quad, is a new but strong alliance between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. Both alliances have proved to be strategically powerful and resourceful when checking China's regional power. We have erected countless barriers against China. Furthermore, we believe that its current alienation from countries in the region will make it more cautious when taking action. This is exemplified by India, a country with which the U.S. has been building a strong relationship with that has nuclear deterrence over China. Because of the containment and alliances, China knows that if it wishes to encroach on the interests of one of U.S.'s allies, it will face great resistance from many other U.S. allies within the region, disincentivizing them to do anything drastic with their domestic situation while going through a period of heavy turbulence. Next, with these organizations and relations in place, we believe that what the U.S. has done for the region is already enough, and any further action within the Indo-Pacific will create an action-reaction cycle of agitating China to take more drastic measures. Working in response to America's diverse alliances, China lashes out dramatically against the formation and continuation of these alliances. For example, in response to a Quad dialogue to distribute a network of land-based anti-ship missiles, China responded by doubling down on strategic and military cooperation with Russia. They've also committed to expand bilateral nuclear energy cooperation in response to more announcements. Thus, any further U.S. action could result in China being even more aggressive in the South China Sea to avoid feeling completely boxed in. Japan may be joining AUKUS soon, and the Quad has been rumored to add South Korea changing into the Quint. We find these developments to be troublesome and do not want to needlessly alienate China, even more by expanding the membership of these organizations. Thus, measures such as forming an Asian equivalent of NATO will be completely out of the picture. An Indo-Pacific organization with a formal military structure and organization is perhaps the most provoking thing we can do to China. Not only the formation of new organizations built to balance China, also the strengthening of pre-existing organizations should be strictly limited. We should push for a standstill on funding growth into these organizations. This means stopping building infrastructure in new facets of these alliances. And additionally, it means not giving any more states to join in on alliances like AUKUS or the Quad. By halting growth of these organizations, it effectively counterbalances China greatly and reduces tensions between the US and China. Additionally, we can look to how Russia has responded to the eastward expansion of NATO as a reference point to how China might act. That said, this could result in our allies feeling uneasy over a softer stance in China, making them look for ways to build up their own methods of deterrence, which could agitate China to a greater extent. Thus, we must reaffirm our security commitments to our allies, primarily Japan and South Korea, assuring them that they do not need to massively increase their military capabilities. More barriers are not good for us, China, or the entire region. They will limit our ability to work together and provide grounds for friendly cooperation to provoke China. The constant competition puts all of the region's efforts into preparation aimed at containment and balancing. These limit our ability to cooperate together for economic trade, working on shared issues, or even stabilizing tensions to prevent a hot war. Finally, recognizing that China is not averse to cooperation, we should look to create new channels of communication within the region. For example, we can build upon efforts made to open military communications between the US and China this year and expand these methods of communication. Working together with China will limit tensions and force us to collaborate for a brighter and more peaceful future. Furthermore, we should look towards building organizations against shared issues such as climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, or ocean preservation, and offer China a spot into these organizations. This is an argument that a more aggressive foreign policy cannot offer. By trying to be more cooperative and showing acts of good faith to China, we can provide a more sustainable future. After all, there is no more pressing issue than global warming, and it is something that affects the entire world, not just US and China. Solving these challenges is nearly impossible without Chinese cooperation, and these problems become significantly easier to solve with China by our side. Additionally, in the spirit of working with China, the South China Sea has proved to be a key point in US and China foreign policy. We recognize the importance of keeping South China Sea peaceful and secure, and also look to work with China to calm tensions. We will limit the amount of freedom of navigation patrol ships yearly from 29 different patrols to 10 to help stabilize regions and to symbolically show good faith to China. Not only keeping China passive and encouraged is important, but additionally gaining the help of one of the strongest nations in the world on shared issues would be a powerful tool to tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time. I now turn to Ming, our economic expert.
I'm Ming, and I'll be discussing the economic and political aspects of our recommendations for American foreign policy. Based on our team's assessments, 3 primary areas should hold the focus of American foreign policy moving forward. The administration should, 1, shift its outlook on China's actions and intentions. When describing foreign policy towards China, words such as growing aggressiveness, military intentions, and threatening are used, indicating that the United States believes China poses a true threat to the global order. In turn, the United States counters China with aggressiveness and assertiveness, further provoking China to retaliate. 2, strive towards the normalization of US-China relations. While previous US presidents have negotiated trading agreements with China, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership under the Obama administration, which was later withdrawn by President Trump, we currently do not have a normal trading relationship with China. Under the Trump administration, the United States imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods and strengthened regulation over high-tech exports. Recently, keeping President Trump's tariffs President Biden introduced export controls on microchips, increased tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and increased the difficulty of American investment in Chinese markets. This unproductive trade relationship leads to diplomatic tensions and the unlikelihood of cooperation between the United States and China. 3, potential cooperation on global issues and security interests. There are more significant issues at hand that impact everyone, such as climate change and nuclear nonproliferation. Tackling these issues now can bring mutual benefits for both parties and the rest of the world. The chief goal of the CCP is to ensure its own survival. This entails China's overwhelming focus on internal stability above all else. Various factors have caused instability in China. On the one hand, after the CCP conceded to public dissent and protests such as the A4 revolution during the pandemic, the results of a post-zero COVID campaign, China have left the CCP to prioritize legitimizing their rule and authority over Chinese citizens. On the other hand, China faces numerous domestic issues, including dwindling population growth, a shrinking workforce, decreasing optimism amongst the youth, and increasing national debt, leading to national economic challenges and popular discontent. Most importantly, China's economic growth is slowing. What this looks like is, instead of the rising into the double digits of its GDP growth rate like in the past, its growth rate in 2022 was 2.99%, with economists predicting that it will stay at around this rate for the foreseeable future. This is primarily due to the imbalance in Chinese domestic consumption and investment within their own economy. But it is also related to China's aging population, a demographic challenge that threatens the CCP goals of stimulating the economy. Economic challenges experienced by the Chinese population have led to dissatisfaction regarding the economy and indicators of quality of life, such as income and employment. A combination of all of these reasons suggests that it is highly unlikely for a Beijing military intervention. This leaves Taiwan, the South China Sea, and establishing a regional hegemony off the table. Ratcheting down on tariffs and striving for a normal trade relationship should be a priority in American foreign policy moving forward. A normal relationship seeks to foster a less conflictual and more productive trading dynamic, which ultimately benefits both parties, but it is not possible to create this normalcy if the United States continues to press on existing problems and maintains its negative views of China. China is one of the largest export markets for the United States goods and services, and the United States is one of the largest markets for China. There is a need for a slow and safe de-escalation of conflicts to get into a position to make reciprocal deals, such as getting Beijing to lower their trade tariffs and barriers if the United States lowers theirs first. We may want to retain our restrictions on Chinese AI technology, including regulations on American investment in Chinese firms developing artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computers. But note that any further tariffs on China are unnecessary and only amplify tensions. The United States administration should remove past tariffs as a way to move away from this aggressive relationship we have with China. An interdependent and cooperative trading policy with lower consumer prices, increase the value of exports, and support jobs. Decoupling from China is unnecessary. We only need to side note Chinese aggression to allow for further integration of both countries as a guarantee of security. The United States should also stop pressuring its allies to place tariffs on China and instead inspire American allies to trade normally with China. A trade war needlessly provokes conflict. Rather than continuing the extreme, we should think about advantageous economic relationships and mutual benefits, as well as taking a step back from the Biden approach to our relationship with Beijing. We have misread China as an aggressive power, causing the United States to facilitate trade wars and other needless conflicts, This in itself is a dangerous and self-fulfilling prophecy. This economic cooperation can set a baseline for less animosity between the two countries and more collaboration in areas such as climate change to work towards a better future. The basic premise of our strategy is that China has a lot of economic problems, but it also holds a lot of strengths, such as solar panels, EV batteries, and electric cars. For example, China is the world's largest wind and solar energy producer and the largest investor in renewable energy. Furthermore, China dominates the global EV and battery markets due to its access to critical minerals, production capacity, and investments in innovation. A partnership between the United States and China would help progress global efforts towards green energy and reducing carbon emissions. It is impossible to confront global issues effectively without Chinese cooperation. Beyond close coordination, this leaves more channels for negotiation, such as addressing Beijing's IP theft, unfair trade practices, forced technology transfer, and nuclear non-proliferation. Opportunities for these interactions may occur only if the United States de-escalates tensions between the two powers. Continued interaction and collaboration are necessary to ensure global security. Now Carrie will conclude our team's recommendations for American foreign policy.
After establishing our plan of action, I would just like to remind everyone of the two principles we set out in the introduction. Firstly, by taking measures to reduce provocation and prevent China from feeling a sense of further isolation, we're ensuring the peace and security of Taiwan and in the Indo-Pacific, avoiding a situation where China feels the need to lash out in a last-ditch effort to achieve their goals. Secondly, we're creating an environment that allows for cooperation between the US and China to take on universally pressing issues, specifically regarding climate change and nuclear non-proliferation. Great powers need to be treated with respect, especially when they're our closest peer competitor. We have to start respecting China's boundaries to prevent a global security crisis and facilitate cooperation over issues that will impact generations to come. However, we're also likewise not naive to the idea that China, if left unchecked, could take more aggressive and assertive actions in a region that harms the interests of US allies. Thus, our proposal still retains measures taken previously by the US to balance China. However, we recognize that there is a limit to what the US should do. The key point is this: we do not want to make our interactions with China a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating a future we're actively trying to avoid. Thank you.
All right, let's hear questions from our experts.
Sure. What I really liked was that there's an underlying theory of how the world works under your presentation, that the security dilemma, that we live in a world where we misinterpret what our adversaries do. They're doing things that defend themselves. We take them the wrong way. Same thing happens on the other side. You're trying to break that chain, which I think is really, so there's an underlying theory. I guess if I were someone who was critiquing it, I would say, well, let's think about the last 30 years of U.S.-China relationships. Crackdown in Tiananmen, what does the U.S. do? Sort of 1989, it looks the other way. 92, 93, reverses position on most favored nation. Late 90s, works at great political cost to bring China into the World Trade Organization with the theory that it would become a responsible stakeholder. The Obama administration made great efforts to sort of create a G2 where U.S. and China, there's a great Sunnydale meeting. The U.S. looks kind of the other way as China ignores the UNCLOS decision against China in the South China Sea. The Hong Kong crackdown, the Trump It's amazing Trump doesn't get more harassment for this. The U.S. basically does nothing. So someone who said, well, maybe it's not security dilemma, it's the absence of deterrence, right? The U.S., whenever it has sought to be friendly, China has just taken and grabbed. And why would one expect, in your proposal, for China not to take this as a signal to continue bad behavior? I guess this is sort of a general theory of the world. What is your response to that, looking at the history of the last 30 years?
I think there's two prominent factors in answering the question. First of all, we have to consider that China is not the same nation that it is before. As we've said, we believe that China is a declining power, and especially considering recent developments in the last 2 to 3 years, China's increasingly become more unstable compared to when it was in these periods that you talked about, and its grasp is waning compared to, say, 2021 when they cracked down on Hong Kong. Simultaneously, we want to remind you that our policy is not a strict policy of appeasement. We're also recognizing that China could be a threat, and we're still maintaining many organizations that we built in the region to contain China. So it is we're recognizing what fits the status quo.
Is there an expectation that China should respond? I was listing the things that China had been unhelpful with: international property rights, trade, cyber, opioids, currency manipulation, in addition to Taiwan. Is there something, is this kind of like a U.S. unilateral decision? Our theory of the world is that we're scaring China. Would you expect China, what would you expect China to do in response to your reassurance? And if it didn't do it, would you alter your policy? Would you push it regardless of what China did? I mean, or regardless of whether or not China, like after you did this, would you expect China to sort of, I don't know, do something to demonstrate that it recognized and to be reassuring, to kind of do its part? Is that necessary, and what would it be? What would you do if it didn't happen?
Right. We do believe that is necessary, and we do believe that is the most likely scenario. As well, the last 5 years since I can't do math. Sorry. Since 2016, since the Trump administration, we've demonstrated the U.S. capability to impose stricter limitations on China, to limit Chinese core interests, and China obviously does not want this. So we've shown them what we can do. Now we can show them what we can do to cooperate and improve the world. In terms of whether or not this will...
We've already sent the hard message, now it's time to do the reassurance.
Yeah. In terms of what we will do if they do not necessarily respond well, first and foremost, we do believe that going down the current path of U.S. foreign policy will ultimately result in a hot war or a intensified Cold War with China. And that is the absolute worst case scenario. We want to absolutely avoid that. So yes, we will unilaterally take steps back to ensure that at least the security dilemma is eased and tensions in the Indo-Pacific are not at an absolute ticking point.
I have a question related to Professor Gavin's, and the question is, so say it's 3 years from now, you've been implementing this strategy, and you get intel from the IC saying Xi Jinping is now calculating that prospects for reunification with Taiwan have improved significantly. It's feasible, Xi Jinping thinks. The U.S., time has not stood still.
What kind of reunification, Rachel?
Forceful reunification. Forceful reunification. Time has not stood still in these 3 years. American capabilities have not improved. PRC capabilities have improved. The PRC is interpreting the absence of military exercises with its allies as an admission that the U.S. is not committed to the fight to defend Taiwan. There have been no further statements, gaffes from the president, moving strategic ambiguity closer to an unambiguous commitment. In fact, if there have been any gaffes, they've been in the opposite direction, sort of pulling the United States away from a commitment to defend Taiwan. Your intelligence suggests that the PRC is preparing to invade Taiwan within about a year. It's not imminent, there are preparations underway. What went wrong with your strategy, and what would you do in light of this new intelligence?
I can start. So, in terms
Why don't
of...
we have someone else start?
Okay.
I would say we would be confident in what we have done so far in terms of equipping Taiwan for defense. So again, all of the weapons that we are providing them for a purely defensive effort. If we got intelligence that there was an imminent war approaching, we would not forcibly become involved. We know that if this were to happen, China would have to exhaust its resources in repressing dissent in Taiwan. We are confident in how we've equipped Taiwan, and we are confident in Taiwan's ability to react to that. But we do not believe that getting forcibly involved, positioning the United States centrally in this conflict will help our relations at all with China, and we don't think that's worth it. When we know that we've done enough to show our allies in that region, like Japan and all that, that we have, been supporting them. So I feel like we have done enough, and we'll move from there in terms of how we'll strategically play it out. But we would not forcibly get involved.
So willing to let Taiwan go, or maybe a different way to put it is willing to let the PRC try and hopefully fail in its attempt to take Taiwan?
Yes, we would let that happen, knowing what we've done and knowing that putting everything on the line for Taiwan will not be worth it when we've done enough, and we're confident in our ability with our support, Taiwan being able to defend itself.
Interesting. So that's consistent. So this strategy is pricing in the possibility
Yeah.
that it'll lead to.
I heard her say in your scenario, nothing went wrong with our strategy.
Exactly.
Our strategy is working as
And we're willing
China's about to make a big mistake with their strategy for some reason, but that happens sometimes. I'd like to ask a question that I want to start with you, Ming, because a lot of it was in your section of the presentation, but it went over in some other sections as well, so you can all get involved. Which is, you told this story about China's overwhelming focus on regime stability, right, and all the domestic problems they have. And at the beginning of the presentation, that was like one of a number of forms of decline, right? And it was in those sections of the presentation that I started to get scared. Right? Your perspective seems to be they're declining, things are getting worse for them, that's better for us. But a huge part of international relations history has been great powers who think the future is getting worse, deciding that they have to act rashly now, right? And part of that's a military argument about decline, but it's more than that, right? There's a pretty good article written by Jack Snyder called 1914, Everybody's Favorite Year for War. Right? And some of it's a classic sort of preventive war argument, but some of it's about how all of these actors saw their opportunity for what they wanted diminishing, right? And so I guess my question is, why shouldn't that, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, really scare us and really say, sure, it would be great to break out of the security dilemma eventually. But that's a long-term policy. It takes a while, as Frank points out. The response isn't always what you want. You kind of have to let them sort of get 2 tits for 1 tat in, right? And it's like, maybe it's too soon to pursue your policy. That's sort of what popped into my head. So I wonder what you think of that, and how would you comment in general on like decline being dangerous in the short term?
That's a really great question. Our team believes that now is a great time to implement this sort of policy because, well, if we were to box in China, if China felt very boxed in and had no more choices, then yes, it would be very dangerous. But if we're offering them a solution for things to get better in the future, whether it's near, short term, or long term, there might be a less of a willingness from China to do something drastic like you're describing.
So your theory, because it's interesting, it's a good question. It's never been clear to me whether we should be more afraid of what rising powers should do or what declining powers should do. And I think we do a terrible job of actually measuring it. But your basic idea is that they're a declining power, and that's actually that's when you need to reassure someone the most, because you actually you're not as concerned about the threat over the long horizon. You don't want them to do what Brendan suggested, which is we have to act now or never.
This goes back into Carrie's description about respect. There's a reason why powerful leaders in China use this sort of rhetoric, the humiliation they suffered from Western powers. There's a reason why they were powerful using this sort of rhetoric, and it's because, well, Chinese citizens want to believe in a leader. They're more willing to believe in a leader and follow a leader who doesn't strive to stay as second best, who wants to be the best. So I guess what our team is trying to say is President Xi Jinping is more worried about his own stability as a leader within his domestic affairs rather than what's happening on the outside.
So one of the things that I really was struck by and impressed by, and it got me thinking, was you identify these set of problems that require cooperation from China. It's sort of transnational, climate crisis. You can imagine, I don't know, 20 million people died from the COVID pandemic. If the U.S. and China had even basic cooperation, that number might be half. And I was thinking to myself about the great example of great power rivals in a similar, more dangerous situation cooperating. And it's, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union. Right after the Cuban Missile Crisis that Brendan referred to earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union worked together on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, the most successful arms control treaty ever. At the same time, lesser known, but perhaps more consequential, they worked together to eliminate smallpox, which had killed 300 million people in the 20th century up to that point, twice as many people that had died in every war. 2 million people a year died of smallpox in 1965, and 1975, 0 died. And I was thinking to myself, that's what we want, right? Whether it's climate, whether it's emerging technology. And I was trying to think, because what you would want would be the circumstances that would create that. And so part of me was trying to think, was that made possible because of eliminating a security dilemma, or was it because the Soviets and Americans got so scared from the Cuban Missile Crisis that you really had to sort of push things and put a knife right to their throat and say, one step further and we're slashing to promote cooperation? So I don't know, right? That's the whole thing. And I'm wondering, is there a way, is your strategy, you hint at it, can you get that kind of cooperation while still recognizing that this is an ideological geopolitical foe who in your fantasy world you do want to have disappear, and you do want the regime to collapse, right? Like, there was nobody in the mid-1960s who wouldn't have, if they saw the picture of 1990, said, yeah, let me sign up for that. But while in the meantime, let's not blow up the planet. Like, how do you balance between the recognition that China does threaten, is a geopolitical and ideological rival, with the fact that you can't solve fundamentally existential issues challenging the planet without cooperation? And is this enough, or is there a risk here that you can't do it? Like, how does my model from the mid-1960s sort of match with this?
Can I build on that? I mean, you're saying things like climate change, what could be more important, non-proliferation, what could be more important. Why not go even further than what you're talking about and try to look for some sort of grand bargain that meets China's most vital needs and the U.S.'s most vital needs?
I guess I could start. So the reason why there is no grand deal that is occurring right now is because China feels threatened by the United States, and the United States feels threatened by China. So we're at I guess I want to say we're at a place where no one knows how to take the next move except for saying, oh, I'm going to do this if you don't do that. So I guess we're very supportive of some sort of plan to have a very comprehensive and full conversation between the two to kind of ease out these worries about existential crises that may or may not happen, because a lot of these issues come from a lack of communication or believing false rumors.
I think just there's an interesting thing, and I don't know what the answer is, and maybe you guys do, between one answer is the grand bargain, and the other is, no, that's the worst thing. What you want to do is find specific issues and just work them and acknowledge you're not going to work others. And I don't know what the right answer is, but that from a grand strategy perspective would be an interesting thing to say, like, we're not going to solve Taiwan, right? That's just not going to happen. But does that mean we can't work together to do a lot better job on public health, which is going to be an issue, right? Or emerging tech. And so I don't know what the right answer is, but I think Galen's question that would be interesting to know, whether you think having an overarching, like, let's get together, we're not going to defend Taiwan, but you're going to do these other things, or whether it's like, no, we're going to agree to disagree on a lot of these sorts of issues, but there are some shared interests that we can work on, and let's carve that space. And is that possible? And I don't know how your view on that is.
I think in an ideal world, a grand bargain would be the best. It'll suit U.S. interests, it'll suit Chinese interests. However, we do live in a time period of heightened tensions, and we have to be realistic. We have to recognize that a grand bargain at this moment simply is impossible. There's too much mistrust going on due to the efforts of previous administrations, and we really have to take it a step at a time. So the way forward really is to tackle one issue at a time with China and open up these channels, set that norm of cooperation and communication, and perhaps one day a grand bargain could be possible.
Why not say, Xi Jinping, Taiwan's yours. We won't mess with it. Do what you'd like as the grand bargain. Is there a reason? What's the reason in this?
What are a few million Taiwanese in the face of climate change and AI and these other issues you pointed to?
Well, Taiwan does have a lot of value to us, and even though we're not saying that we're going to start World War III to support them, we do want to support them. So there is the fact that they are a liberal democracy, one of the more progressive in the region that we do want to support, in terms of just America's ongoing view of having more democratic powers in the world. Democratic regions does support, like, universally American ambitions. They also have a strategic position for our allies, which is really important. If China did get Taiwan, it would be a problem in terms of the military, in supporting Japan, Korea. All of those places would be in a more deal of trouble. So while Taiwan is not the hill we're going to die on, it is really important to us. It's a valuable region, and we will do what's reasonably possible to support that region.
I'd like to ask a question first to you, Alden. And it plays off of Galen's question, but the basic frame for it is that security dilemma sucks, right? It's very hard to get out of. If you look in past history, like the major kinds of reconciliation between big powers usually tend to happen, one, if there's some other third big threat that they both decide they need to come together for, or if one of them is basically collapsing and gives up, right? And the policy that you've described for easing the security dilemma is basically to keep all the pieces of our policy that have heightened the security dilemma and just not do any more, right? And it seems like if I look at history, like the that's like deeply incommensurate with what it's historically taken to break out of a security dilemma, right? Like, it's not nearly enough in terms of the signals you would need to send to get the other guy to start to believe that actually maybe you don't want to strangle him in his sleep, right? And so, you know, when you look at the things we've done, the Quad, AUKUS, you know, various cooperation with India, right? They're like not even that sort of central to everything we do. Like, they're not like NATO, right? They're not something that we've been deeply invested in. Why not get rid of that stuff, right? Why not say, you know what? It's not worth it. These are policies that don't provide us with very much, and even if their Chinese are sort of crazy, like, it makes them more crazy. Like, let's try to actually send the signal that we mean business about a really different relationship.
Can I add a flip side on that, which is how the regional partners would respond to your strategy? Obviously, I know how they'd respond to Brendan's. They would start bandwagoning with China, right, which is not an outcome we particularly probably want. But one of the great concerns, and this was something that happened in the Cold War, if you do the kind of G2 superpowers, let's kind of cooperate, people underneath are worried, well, we can't trust you. You're going to sell us out. You're someone like Kishida. You're in Japan. You're sort of leadership in the Philippines. You're South Korea. You're like, man, the Americans are flaky. We're the ones who are going to risk the ire of China. You know, the U.S. will live to fight another day. How can we trust these people if after all this time they build all this stuff and now all of a sudden they're taking their foot off the gas? And what are the consequences there? So it's the flip side of Brendan's question.
Our group's position is that though there is no military organized thing like an Asian NATO, these alliances are nonetheless still effective at counterbalancing China. They have worked to give Australia powers that they could not even be allowed to through loopholes in the NPT. It continues to prove these are still the strongest alliances within the region and prove nonetheless effective, and China is considering them worthy to be kind of deterred and angered by. So these alliances are powerful within themselves, and pushing for that organized military action could prove to be the most possible, the worst possible thing we could do to provoke China. And effectively, these counterbalancing alliances, I'd say, work well enough. And within, yeah.
And it is precisely to Professor Gavin's point that we cannot abandon these organizations right now. We need to reaffirm our allies that they will be protected and that we are not just leaving them hanging in the face of China so that they, in turn, try to develop their own nuclear deterrence or something like that and further destabilize the region to an even greater degree.
Is it fair to say then that your team values the status quo much more than it values future cooperation with China?
I would say that we value the current peace in the status quo, but we're looking for cooperation.
Sure, but you might not get it if you're committed to the status quo.
We believe that in the status quo, China currently sees us as a power that is increasingly trying to keep them in the chokehold. And we believe that China believes that in the next 10 years, same trends will continue and there will be intensified competition. So if we dissuade them that this is not the next 10 years, that is not the reality, we are willing to work with you in some areas, then we are in effect changing from current attitudes of the status quo without abandoning the peace.
So there seems to be two different policy theories here. One is what I think Brendan's getting at, and that is the idea that you've done just enough and we've gotten to a place where China recognizes the status quo is good, but if we push it any further, we can drive into a great power war. And so it's sort of a balancing, and it's about status quo. There's another that says, actually, policy is focused on the wrong set of issues, right? And this gets to Rachel's question about Taiwan. Like, it's important, and you acknowledge it's important, but it's coming at the cost of other issues which may be more important, as well as risking a war that we really don't want to fight, right? So one is about, hey, it's been A+ so far, but one of the keys in grand strategy is know when to cash in your chips, and now it's cashing in your chips time. The other seems to be, we've gotten lucky in some ways because our focus has been wrong, and we've risked a dangerous war while also, bungling climate, bungling emerging tech, and really bungling public health. And so I guess, which is it? Does that make sense?
I mean, running with the analogy, we're cashing in our chips and playing at a different table.
So you get best of both, okay.
So we're dealing with a completely new set of issues.
Playing a different game.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I wonder what game the Chinese are playing. But
Well, I'm gonna give the experts a break so we can get to lunch on time. So I'll invite Team B to ask Team A a question, and then vice versa. You get one question per team.
And one answer per team.
You got it.
Okay. So, my question is, you portray this narrative that the CCP is retreating from the foreign sector, that it wants to de-escalate, and it's going to focus on its domestic concerns. But if you look at the South China Sea, it is escalating its conflict. Blood has been drawn for the first time in the South China Sea by China, despite of the zero China policy, despite all the domestic concerns. So, if it's escalating now, why do you say it won't escalate in the future?
We believe that it's escalating now because of U.S. aggression and U.S. encouraged aggression by its allies in the region, and that is a product of the current U.S. grand policy. However, we fundamentally disagree with the idea that China will continue in this course because we believe that beyond the ideological aspects of the current Chinese regime, it is ultimately still a pragmatic government that doesn't want to risk a conflict and doesn't want to further risk destabilizing its own society.
All right, your chance to return fire.
Okay. So, noting that your group suggests the creation of an Asian equivalence of NATO, do you expect this act to further induce China into doubling down on the strategic and military alliances with countries such as Russia, the DPRK, and Iran? If you do expect so, does this indicate that the U.S. will have to do even more in the region than what you're suggesting, heightening tensions to a greater degree?
That's a really good question. Okay. I think a few days ago, North Korea and Russia engaged in a conversation over Russia guaranteeing North Korea some sort of nuclear assistance, and that was a huge problem for China because that's not something that China wants. So I'm not entirely convinced that China would align itself with what some scholars would call the axis of upheaval. I think what we have right now in our proposal of the Asian NATO is kind of enough as it stands. Is there more to that question?
Okay, well, let's give both teams a round of applause.